They laughed when she walked in, a quiet woman, gray-haired, wearing a coat that smelled faintly of old paper and sea salt. She carried no credentials on a lanyard, no ribbons on her chest. She set her canvas bag down near the back row of folding chairs the way someone sets a grocery bag on a kitchen counter without ceremony, without hesitation, as if she had always been in this room, and always intended to leave it undisturbed. No one bothered to look twice, until the Admiral did. His eyes moved across the room in the way of men trained to inventory a space in seconds, counting exits, assessing postures, cataloging threats. They stopped on her wrist, specifically, on a faded mark just below the hem of her sleeve, exposed where the wool had ridden up when she reached to adjust the chair beside her. The room was loud with the self-congratulatory noise of accomplished people. Then it wasn't. Rear Admiral Clifford Marsh, a man who had not stood quickly for anything in 11 years, stood. His voice, when it came, was not theatrical. It was the quiet voice of someone reporting a fact. She outranks every sniper in this room. And just like that, the woman they had mocked became the most dangerous person alive. The town of Larkhaven, Maine had a particular kind of winter. Not the postcard kind, not the blue-skied, fresh powder kind that photographed well. Larkhaven's winter was gray and relentless, driven by sea wind that came off the Atlantic with something close to intent. The kind of cold that worked its way into buildings, into the joints of old docks, into the memory of people who had lived there long enough to stop fighting it. The post office stood at the end of Compass Street, between a hardware store that had been half renovated for 6 years and a diner that served the same 3 soups from October through March. The building itself was a low, wide structure of red brick, its sign weather-bleached to a soft pink, its hours stenciled in black letters that no one consulted because everyone in town already knew them. Evelyn Marsh had been postmaster for 14 years. Before that, the townspeople knew very little about her, and she had done nothing to remedy this. She had arrived in Larkhaven in the early 2000s appeared, more accurately, the way a piece of driftwood appears on a shore, without witness, without explanation, already worn into its final shape. She had purchased a small house on the eastern edge of town, the one with the collapsed fence and the view of the water, and she had begun sorting mail. She was 68 years old. She wore her hair in a braid that had gone entirely silver, pinned at the nape of her neck with a clip that looked older than most of the buildings in town. Her hands were large for a woman of her frame. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, not soft, not warm, but not unkind either. The color of winter water, the color of patience pressed into a physical form. She rose at 4 o'clock every morning. This was known because Greta Paulson, who lived 2 doors down and suffered from insomnia, had noted the light in Evelyn's kitchen appearing with an accuracy that Greta had come to rely on, in the way that coastal people rely on tide tables, not comforting exactly, but steady. True. Greta had once asked Evelyn why she rose so early. Evelyn had said, "Because the morning is quieter, and because quiet is useful." Greta assumed this meant that Evelyn baked, or read, or did the solitary things that solitary people do before the world assembles itself into noise. She did not ask further. In Larkhaven, people's early mornings were their own. What Evelyn actually did in those hours was this. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window looking at the water for as long as it took to drink the coffee, and then she went to the spare room at the back of the house and performed, in silence and without an audience, a set of physical disciplines that she had maintained for more than 40 years. Not the fitness routines of someone trying to stay young, the routines of someone trying to stay ready for a circumstance that might never arrive, and was prepared to do this indefinitely, and found in the preparation itself a satisfaction that was its own justification. There was a box on the shelf above Evelyn's desk at the post office. Wooden, old, secured with a padlock that no one had ever seen her open. The box had been there since her first day. Visitors sometimes asked about it. Evelyn always answered the same way, a slight shift of her chin toward the counter, redirecting the visitors' attention to whatever they had actually come for. The box was never explained. The subject was never revisited. Most people in Larkhaven regarded Evelyn with the comfortable, mild affection reserved for fixtures: the clock in the town square, the bench outside the hardware store, the postmaster herself. She was part of the town the way weather was part of it, necessary in a background sense, not thought about directly. Douglas Harker, who ran the American Legion post and still wore his Vietnam-era patches on his jacket even in July, had once studied her from across the diner in a way that made his coffee go cold. He could not have said exactly what he was looking at, only that there was something in the way she sat, the particular stillness, the arrangement of her hands on the table, the way her eyes moved when someone came through the door that made him feel, obscurely, as if he were the one being observed. He never mentioned it to anyone. There was no language for it that would not have sounded foolish. The letter arrived at the Larkhaven post office on a Tuesday in February, addressed to E. Marsh. It bore the seal of the Atlantic Regional Military Heritage Symposium, an annual gathering of veterans, active duty personnel, and invited specialists held that year at a converted armory in Bangor. The letter had been misfiled by a volunteer coordinator who had cross-referenced 2 different Marsh listings in the regional directory and selected the wrong one. Evelyn held the envelope for a long time before opening it. She did not look troubled by it. She looked, briefly, like a person doing arithmetic, running numbers in her head, arriving at a figure she had not expected but could work with. Then she folded the letter, placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, and continued sorting the morning delivery. She attended. She drove herself to Bangor on a gray Thursday morning. The highway empty in the way of winter highways in Maine, long straightaways between bare tree lines, the occasional truck, the sky the color of unpolished pewter. She did not listen to the radio. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and her mind in whatever place her mind went when it was not occupied with immediate tasks. Not far, not close, the middle distance that certain people inhabit habitually, and that looks like distraction to people who do not recognize it as its opposite. She arrived 40 minutes early. She sat in the parking lot for 15 of those minutes, watching the armory's stone facade, watching the people who moved in and out of it, cataloging their postures and their bearing and the shapes of what they were carrying. Then she went inside. The armory had been dressed up for the occasion in the way that institutional buildings are dressed up: folding tables covered with pressed white cloths, name placards in small plastic holders, coffee urns at both ends of the room, a stage at the far end, rows of chairs. At the back, a long gallery of photographs, soldiers in various eras, various theaters, their faces uniformly serious, uniformly young. She found the 3rd row from the back, set her canvas bag on the chair beside her. The room filled gradually. Uniforms, medals, the particular posture of people accustomed to standing at attention even when they were sitting down. A cluster of younger attendees near the front, a mixed group, civilian and military, several of them clearly present for the afternoon's demonstration, a showcase of long-range marksmanship organized by the Army Marksmanship Unit. Among the demonstrators, Captain Brianna Cole, 29 years old, a decorated sniper whose photograph had appeared in 2 national publications in the preceding year. She sat with 3 other members of her unit, their body language unanimous, the ease of people who belong somewhere, who know they belong, and know that others know it too. It was Cole who first noticed Evelyn. She leaned toward the man beside her, Sergeant First Class Derek Odom, and said something quiet. Odom glanced at Evelyn, then looked away. Cole's expression did not change, but the quality of her attention shifted in the way of someone cataloging an anomaly. She had spent 8 years learning to read rooms, and rooms were made of people. And this particular person, the gray-haired woman in the coat that smelled of old paper, sitting alone in the 3rd row from the back as if she had chosen the seat after careful consideration, was not reading correctly, not threatening, not suspicious, just slightly off. The way an object placed 2 centimeters out of alignment in a room that is otherwise symmetrical is slightly off. Noticeable, without being explainable. When the morning session broke for coffee and the room loosened into informal conversation, a junior officer named Lieutenant Wallace approached the back row. He was doing the thing young officers sometimes did at events like this, moving through the room with the slightly exaggerated confidence of someone still deciding what kind of man he was. "Are you here with the Veterans Auxiliary?" he asked, pleasantly enough, but the question was its own answer. Evelyn looked at him. "No," she said. "Guest of someone attending? I received an invitation." He absorbed this without apparent discomfort. "Well, enjoy the afternoon." He moved on. From the front of the room, Cole had watched the exchange. She turned back to Odom. "Did you see her bag?" she said. "She brought her own lunch." Odom did not reply. He was watching Evelyn in the particular way Douglas Harker had watched her in the Larkhaven diner 3 winters ago. Not with any articulable suspicion, only with the sense, obscure and unreasoning, that something in the geometry of the room had shifted without his understanding how. The afternoon session opened with a brief address from the symposium's organizing colonel, followed by a 40-minute presentation on advances in precision optics, the kind of talk that produced nodding heads and notebook jottings among the technical specialists and polite, glazed attention from everyone else. Then the demonstration began. The armory had an attached indoor range, a long, concrete corridor fitted with movable target systems and a full ventilation setup, smelling of oil and cement, and the particular chemical cleanness of a space maintained for a specific, serious purpose. The targets were set at various distances. The audience stood behind a glass partition. Cole and her team presented first. They were efficient and precise and entirely deserving of the attention they received. Cole herself was impressive, composed, methodical, her breathing slow and visible between shots. She struck at 1,200 meters, with what the program notes described as statistically improbable consistency. The room was genuinely awed. The presentations continued. 3 more shooters, different platforms, different distances, overlapping commentary from a technical officer with a microphone. At some point, someone noticed that Evelyn had followed the group into the range viewing area. She stood near the back, her canvas bag over one shoulder, watching the targets through the glass with an expression of mild, unhurried interest. The kind of expression a person might wear watching the tide come in. It was the junior coordinator, a young specialist named Marcus Webb, who made the mistake of asking, brightly, whether she'd like to try a round. He meant it generously. He was aware of having been slightly rude earlier and was, in the way of young people trying to correct course without admitting error, overcompensating. Just for fun, he added. We've got a range officer who can set up something simple. Might be a nice experience. Several people nearby heard this and adjusted their posture, which is what people do when they sense something is about to be mildly embarrassing and haven't decided yet whether to intervene or watch. Cole, 3 feet to the left, did not turn her head, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn looked at Webb for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you serve?" Webb blinked. "I'm sorry." "As a courtesy," she said, "it's useful to know who you're speaking with before making certain offers." The room went a degree quieter. "I apologize," Webb said, and meant it, though he was not entirely sure why. "No need," Evelyn said. She looked back at the range. "I'll take you up on it." Now Cole turned. Her expression was carefully neutral, but she looked at the older woman with the full attention of a person recalibrating. Odom, beside her, crossed his arms and said nothing. He had stopped wanting to say anything several minutes ago. They set up a station at the near end of the range. The range officer, a staff sergeant named Phil Denny, who had been running demonstration days for 6 years and had long ago lost his capacity for genuine surprise, explained the setup with professional brevity. Target at 800 meters. Standard silhouette. The rifle available for her use was a modern precision platform with a top-tier variable scope, adjustable stock, and a trigger that had been tuned to a crisp 2-pound break. Evelyn studied the rifle for a moment. She did not touch it immediately. She looked at it the way a person looks at a map of a place they have already been checking for discrepancies between memory and the current version. "Is there something simpler?" she asked. Denny looked at her. "How do you mean?" "Older. Fixed magnification. Less glass between me and the target." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to a storage cabinet at the side wall and came back with a case. Inside, a bolt-action rifle that had been in the armory's collection for decades, fitted with a period-correct fixed power scope, the kind of optic that had not been considered best practice for 30 years. "That's a museum piece," said one of Cole's teammates, not cruelly, but without any particular care about whether he sounded cruel. Evelyn picked it up. Her hands found the grip and the forend in a single, unhesitating movement, the way hands find a familiar object in the dark. She checked the chamber, adjusted her cheek weld, settled into a position that was not quite the textbook prone of modern instruction but was something older, lower, quieter, more completely still. Denny called the range hot. The room behind the partition was very quiet now. She did not rush. The shot, when it came, was preceded by a stillness so complete that several observers found themselves holding their breath without deciding to. The report cracked through the range. The target 800 meters distant showed a ragged hole exactly centered in the upper thoracic. Webb, who had grown up hunting with his father in Vermont and understood what he had just seen, let out a breath slowly. Cole stared at the target for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "First round, fixed scope, no data." A pause. She didn't even dial anything. Denny pulled up the target on the range monitor. The hit coordinates came up on screen. He looked at them. He did not say anything. He set the monitor down and walked back to his station and said, with the measured inflection of a man choosing his words with care, "Target confirmed." At the back of the room, near the door, a man who had arrived during the setup stood watching through the glass partition. Rear Admiral Clifford Marsh, no relation to Evelyn, a coincidence that no one in the room yet considered notable, had come to the symposium for the afternoon policy discussion and had paused here on his way past, drawn by the particular silence of a crowd that has stopped talking. He was 64 years old. He had gray at both temples and the calm, slightly distant expression of someone who has spent 40 years calibrating the distance between what is visible and what is real. He watched Evelyn straighten from the rifle. He watched her set it down with the same unhurried precision with which she had picked it up, and then she reached past the rifle case for her bag, and the sleeve of her coat rode up 3 inches above her left wrist, and Clifford Marsh saw the tattoo. He did not move for 10 full seconds. The mark was faded, decades of weathering had softened its edges, but the insignia was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A frost pattern border, a small, stylized widow's peak at the center, the kind of designation that had existed in classified operational records for 22 years before those records themselves were destroyed. He pushed open the range door and walked in. They moved to a longer lane. This was not a formal arrangement. There was no committee decision, no announcement. It was the natural result of Clifford Marsh speaking quietly to Denny, and Denny disappearing to make calls, and the room reorganizing itself around a new gravity. The second test was not simple. 1,200 meters. A moving target, a mechanized silhouette running a staggered lateral track at variable speed. The wind in the range was not significant controlled environment, minimal draft, but the lateral movement and distance together constituted a challenge that most of the symposium's demonstrators had declined to attempt formally. Cole was offered the shot first. She accepted without hesitation. She was a professional and she was good and she knew it, which is a different thing from arrogance. It was simply factual self-knowledge. She settled in, ran her calculations, adjusted for the movement, waited for the track's pattern to establish itself. Her shots struck the silhouette in the upper arm. A hit, but not a center hit. She cycled the bolt and looked at the target for a long time without expression. "Wind shift in the last half second," she said, consistent with the vent cycling. No one disputed this. It was accurate and it was an explanation, though it was not an excuse, and Cole was not the kind of person who made excuses. Evelyn stood to the side of the station during this. She was watching the target track, not the target, the track itself. The rhythm of it, the 3 points in the cycle where the speed changed almost imperceptibly. When Denny indicated it was her turn, she lay down behind the old rifle with the same absence of theater as before. A minute passed. The room, which had been quietly talking, was no longer talking. 2 minutes. She was not slow. She was doing something, listening for something, reading something in the air or the light or the pattern of movement that was not visible to the observers behind the glass. Odom, who had spent 8 years as a designated marksman before going staff, recognized the quality of the weight. It was not the weight of indecision. It was the weight of someone for whom shooting was not a reflex but a conclusion. The shot. The target stopped its track. On the monitor, center mass, dead center. Cole was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, she said only, what was her lead calculation? Because she was a professional, and because what she had just seen did not fit her existing model of what was possible, and because the only honest response to that was a question, nobody answered her. Nobody knew. Marsh watched from the edge of the room. He had not saluted yet. He was waiting. There were things he needed to confirm. He asked her in the corridor, away from the others. He waited until the room had mostly emptied for a break, and then he walked alongside her toward the water table at the corridor's end, which was as private as anywhere in the armory was likely to get. "I need to ask you something," he said. "You need to ask me several things," she said. "You've been deciding how to start for 20 minutes. He accepted this without surprise. "The insignia on your wrist." She looked at him for a moment, the gray-green eyes not warm, not cold, patient in the way of deep water. "What do you know about it?" "Classified program," he said. 1971 through 1989. No unit designation on record. No personnel roles that survived the 92 purge. He paused. "I came across a reference in a brief I wasn't meant to see 9 years into my career. A cold weather precision unit, designated by a frost symbol." called internally. "Ghost Lattice," she said. The name hit him like cold water. He had seen it once, in a redacted briefing, and never again. "You were active duty." "No," she said. "I was something else." She set her paper cup of water on the table. "Active duty has records. I didn't have records. That's not possible." She looked at him with the mild patience of someone who has had this conversation before, or its equivalent, and has long since stopped being surprised by what other people consider impossible. "The program ran 12 operators over 18 years, she said. "All female. All recruited from outside conventional channels. No rank structure that interfaced with the standard system. Tasking came through a single liaison node that was dissolved when the program ended." A pause. "6 of us are still alive, as of last I counted." "When did you count?" 3 years ago." He absorbed this. "And your operational designation?" A silence. Not a reluctant one, a considered one. The silence of someone deciding not whether to answer, but how much of the answer to give. "They called me Frost Widow," she said. He did not react visibly. He had been told, once, by a man who had since died, that Frost Widow had operated in 4 theaters during the Cold War's final decade. That she had 3 confirmed long-range engagements at distances that exceeded the published records of the era by margins that, at the time, had been attributed to instrument error. The briefing had been given in a small room in Langley, as part of a historical review that had itself been classified at a level Marsh had only recently been cleared for. The man delivering it had spoken in the careful, slightly compressed manner of someone reciting facts that still felt, to him, improbable despite his first-hand knowledge of their source. Marsh had listened without comment. He had filed it. He had moved on. The Cold War was long over. The program was closed. The operators, 6 of them, the man had said, possibly fewer now, had been released into ordinary life with ordinary documents and the prohibition against disclosure that ran for the rest of their natural lives. He had believed this. In the abstract, the way you believe things told to you by credible people about events you cannot independently verify. In the abstract. "What's your longest confirmed shot?" he asked. She looked at him. "That's classified. I have a clearance." "I know," she said. "It's still classified." She picked up her cup. "But it's longer than anything in this building." Marsh returned to the range room and gathered the senior personnel, Cole, Odom, the organizing colonel, 2 technical specialists, and he told them what he knew. He did not dramatize it. He presented it the way he would have presented an intelligence brief, in order, with attribution, with the appropriate caveats for classification and source reliability. "Ghost Lattice. 18 years. 12 operators. No records." The room was quiet in the way of rooms absorbing new information that reorganizes previously established categories. Cole spoke first, because she was Cole and because sitting in disoriented silence was not something she did for very long. "If the records were purged," she said, "how do we verify anything?" "We don't," Marsh said. "That's the nature of what the program was. What we can do." He glanced toward the range window, where Evelyn was visible, standing alone near the target end, her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the distant wall the way she might look at water, "is observe what's in front of us." "That's 1 shot at 800 and 1 at 1200, Cole said. "Both impressive. But there's a gap between impressive and what you're describing." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you what I know. The observed evidence and the classification history are consistent. What you do with that is up to you." Cole looked at the range window for a long time. "If Ghost Lattice operated outside conventional rank structures," she said slowly, "what's her actual standing? Legally, on paper, nowhere," Marsh said. "Formally, she doesn't exist as military personnel. Never did. The program was designed that way. Then she can't outrank anyone. By the book? No." He was quiet for a moment. "But rank is a representation of something. It represents accumulated experience, demonstrated capability, and judgment under conditions that most people don't survive in the way she survived them." He looked at the room. "You can decide for yourself what outranks what." He went back through the door. Behind him, he heard Odom say, very quietly, 3 confirmed engagements above existing records, in the 80s. With the glass they had then, and then nothing. Just the particular sound of people no longer talking because they were thinking. The outdoor range was adjacent to the armory, separated by a vehicle lane and a chain-link fence. It was cold. The February wind off the Penobscot Bay had been building since midday, and by 4 in the afternoon it was coming in at an angle, shifting every 40 seconds or so in the particular pattern of coastal wind in winter, not random, but not regular enough to model mathematically. The kind of wind that defeated systems. The kind of wind that required something other than computation. The target was set at 3,000 meters. This distance had not been part of the afternoon's program. It was not on anyone's clipboard. Denny had walked the distance himself to set the target, and when he came back he did not make eye contact with anyone in particular. He went to the equipment station and began laying out the support gear with a deliberateness that suggested he was giving himself something to do while he processed what was being asked of the afternoon. Several members of the group stood at the range entrance, looking out at the target, a silhouette barely distinguishable at that distance, a smudge against the pale February tree line. The rangefinder confirmed it. Cole held the device for a long time without lowering it, as if a second reading might produce a different number. The spotting equipment tops out at 2400, Denny said. I can get you a reading from the spotter at the target end via radio, but there's a 2-second lag. He paused. I can also tell you that the wind at the far end has been running about 6 to 8 knots out of the northwest. But it's shifting. It's been shifting all afternoon. No one commented on this. Everyone present understood what shifting wind at 3,000 meters meant in terms of the mathematics. The bullet, in flight for something approaching 4 seconds, would experience multiple discrete wind conditions across its path, not a single crosswind to calculate for, but a series of them, overlapping, changing, impossible to model fully in advance. Even with the best modern equipment and a Doppler wind sensor array and a practice spotter, a shot at this distance under these conditions was a low percentage proposition. Without any of those things, Cole stood at the entrance to the range and looked out at the target. She had a rangefinder. She confirmed the distance. She put the rangefinder down and stood with her arms at her sides. No, she said, to no one. A statement of assessment, not refusal. No one had asked her. Evelyn was already behind the rifle, the same old bolt action from the armory's collection. Its fixed scope offering a view of a world that ended several hundred meters short of where she needed to see. She had asked for no adjustments. She had asked for nothing except that the range be cleared and the flag at the far end be positioned where she could see it through the binoculars first, and then be left alone. Odom stood 20 feet back. He had binoculars. He was watching the far flag. Every few seconds he noted the direction and estimated speed in his head, the way he had been trained to do, though the numbers he was producing served no operational function he could identify. The wind, the distance, the scope that could not resolve the target clearly, the cold that made the air slightly denser above the frozen ground, bending the bullet's path in the predictable way of cold air and in the unpredictable way of crosswind and drift, and the 1,000 small variable corrections that at this distance compounded into outcomes that even the best modern systems handled with humility. No sound in the range except the wind and the periodic creak of the fence. Evelyn did not move. She lay behind the rifle in the same low, settled position, the old position, the position that had been developed in conditions and for purposes that no one in the armory had been briefed on. Her breathing was almost invisible. Her right hand, on the grip, was very still. She was not measuring the wind. She was something more than measuring it. She was listening to it the way you listen to a language you have spoken for so long that the grammar has left your conscious mind and become something physical, a thing that lives in the body rather than the brain. 4 minutes. 5. Cole, who had said she would not watch, was watching. The shot, when it came, was almost unremarkable in its sound, just the ordinary crack of a rifle on a winter range, the same sound that had preceded all the others, the same sound that had been produced 30 times that afternoon by a dozen different people under controlled and supported conditions. Then silence. Odom had his binoculars on the target. He was very still. Then he lowered them slowly. Hit, he said. No one in the range area moved or spoke for several seconds. Hit, Cole said finally, to herself, in the tone of someone filing a fact in a place where they will be able to find it later. Not exclamation, not celebration. Just the acknowledgement of a thing that had happened, that could not be unmeasured, that was now, permanently, true. At the range entrance, Marsh stood with his arms at his sides. Evelyn rose from the rifle. She brushed a little dirt from the front of her coat. She looked down the range toward the target she could not see, in the direction of what she had just done, with the same mild, unhurried expression she had worn all afternoon, the expression of someone checking the tide before returning to what they were working on. She walked back toward the armory entrance, and Clifford Marsh stepped aside to let her pass. And then he did something he had not done on a firing range since his first year as an officer. He saluted. It was a full salute, precise, without irony or performance. The kind of salute a person gives not to a rank printed on paper but to something that rank, in its best iteration, is meant to represent. He held it for 3 full seconds. She saw it. She paused for a half-beat, not quite stopping, not quite answering, and then she went inside. They gathered in the briefing room afterward, the same folding chairs, the same white tablecloths, the same coffee urns. The afternoon's agenda had been abandoned. No one had formally cancelled it. It had simply stopped mattering. Marsh stood at the front of the room. He did not give a speech. Speeches were for ceremonies, and this was not a ceremony. He stated facts in the order they were relevant. The program's history, as much as was declassified. The operational context. What Ghost Lattice had been designed to do and how it had done it and what it had cost the people involved to do it, in ways that would never appear on any commendation record because there were no commendation records. The woman who shot today, he said, has more confirmed cold weather long-range engagements than anyone in this room has training hours at those distances. She did this without support infrastructure, without modern ballistic computation, and without the institutional acknowledgement that the military extends to people who perform similar functions within recognized frameworks. He paused. She was deliberately excluded from that acknowledgement as a condition of her service. She agreed to those conditions. She has honored them for 40 years. The room was quiet. The organizing colonel, a man named Frederick Garland, who had 31 years of service and the composure that comes from having been in enough rooms where composure was the only correct response, sat with his hands flat on the table and did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said only, "And who authorized the program?" "People who are no longer in a position to be asked," Marsh said. Garland nodded. Slowly, the nod of a man filing this in the place where he files things that have no institutional resolution. He looked at the range window, and she has never sought recognition. She was contractually prohibited from it, Marsh said, and she has not tried to circumvent that prohibition. In 40 years, another silence. Garland looked at the table. "She's sorting mail in Maine," he said. Not a question. A recitation of fact, the way a person recites a fact when the fact is too strange to do anything else with. "Yes," Marsh said. No one added to this. The gap between what had been done and what had been acknowledged was not a gap that words could bridge in a single afternoon. Garland understood this. They all did. Cole was seated near the aisle, her forearms on her thighs, her gaze on the floor. She was not ashamed. Exactly, shame was not a useful emotion, and Cole did not indulge useless emotions. But she was recalibrating, and the process of recalibration had a texture that was not comfortable. Odom was looking at Evelyn, who sat in the third row with her bag on the chair beside her, her hands folded, her expression unchanged. The junior officer, Wallace, was gripping his own wrist under the table in the way of young men trying to process information that has made their previous understanding of a room feel suddenly thin and provisional. When Marsh finished, Cole stood. She walked to the third row. She stopped in front of Evelyn and looked at her. "I was disrespectful," she said. Not a question, not quite an apology, a statement of fact delivered in the same register Cole used for all factual statements. Direct, without softening. "I'd like to correct that." Evelyn looked up at her. "You were doing what people do when they don't have enough information," she said. "That's different from disrespect." "I had enough information to be courteous," Cole said. "I chose differently." A short silence. "Fair," Evelyn said. Cole extended her hand. Evelyn shook it. Odom stood next. He did not say anything. He simply stood, and the act of standing was its own statement. Wallace stood after him, and then, one by one, the rest of the room, a standing room, not applauding, not cheering, just standing, in the quiet register of recognition, of restitution, of one small correction to a very long account. Evelyn looked at them. She did not look moved in the way the room perhaps wanted her to be moved. She looked at them the way she had looked at the range, the distant target, the shifting wind steadily, and with the patience of someone for whom the distance between the present and the past has long since ceased to feel like a wound, and has become simply the landscape she lives in. "Chiến tranh không phải là nơi để chứng minh bản thân," she said, in a language that was not English. A young interpreter near the door translated it quietly, for those who needed it. "War is not a place for proving yourself." But Cole, who had been deployed twice to places where translation was a survival skill, heard the words before the translation arrived, and her expression shifted in a way that Odom would think about for a long time after. She simply said, without ceremony, "No, it isn't." Evelyn returned to Larkhaven on a Thursday. The town looked the same. The hardware store's half-finished scaffolding had acquired a fresh coat of rust. The diner's soup of the day sign read Pia soup, which it had read for at least the past 6 Thursdays. The post office sign was still the color of old rose. She unlocked the building at 8:05, slightly later than usual, owing to the drive, and went to her desk and began sorting the morning mail. Bills, a seed catalog, a birthday card in a yellow envelope, a card from the local insurance office addressed to current resident, which was addressed to every resident in the town zip code and which Evelyn handled with the same care as everything else, because her opinion of a piece of mail was not a factor in her professional obligation to it. Greta Paulson came in at 9, as she did every Thursday, to pick up a package. She looked at Evelyn and said, "You look tired." "I slept fine." "You look like you drove a long way." "I did," Evelyn said, and handed her the package. Greta lingered at the counter for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to ask more or to let a thing be. Then she tucked the package under her arm and left. Douglas Harker came in at 10:30. He set 3 envelopes on the counter and waited for Evelyn to stamp them. He watched her hands. "Heard you went to Bangor," he said. She looked at him briefly. "Word gets around. Small town." "It does." She handed the envelopes back. "The stamps are already on those. You paid last month. I've been meaning to tell you." She pushed 3 quarters across the counter. He picked them up slowly. He stood for a moment without moving toward the door. "You ever going to tell anyone?" he said. Not rudely, not intrusively, the way you ask a question when you already know the approximate shape of the answer. She considered him. Tell them what? He looked at her, the kind of look that passes between people who have lived in the same place for long enough that words are sometimes more work than they're worth. "Good morning, Douglas," she said. He left. At noon she ate lunch at her desk, a sandwich, an apple, coffee from the small machine on the counter, and she looked at the box on the shelf above her desk. She had not opened it in 3 years. She did not open it today, but she looked at it for a while in the particular way of someone checking that a thing is still where they left it, still as they remember it, still holding what it held. It was. A letter arrived from Bangor on Friday morning. She sorted it herself, as she sorted everything. The return address was the Armory. Inside, a 1-page note from Clifford Marsh, brief and without ornamentation, thanking her for attending. At the bottom, a line, "If you ever find occasion to return to Bangor, the range will be available." She folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer. On Monday, a second letter arrived. This one was handwritten, on plain paper, from Captain Brianna Cole. It was longer than Marsh's letter and less formal and more careful, the carefulness of someone who has thought about what they wanted to say for several days before writing it. Cole thanked her. Cole asked, with what was clearly an unusual degree of personal difficulty, whether she would consider a correspondence questions, when Evelyn was willing to answer them, on the subjects that Cole was beginning to understand she had only partially understood. Evelyn read this twice. She set it on the desk and looked at the window, through which the February harbor was visible gray, textured, moving in the particular quiet way of water that is not near freezing but not warm either. The water that was just water, doing what water does, indifferent to anything that was or was not remarkable about the day. She took a sheet of paper from the supply drawer and a pen, and she wrote a response. It was short. It said, "I'll answer what I can answer. Send your first question when you're ready." She folded it, addressed the envelope, applied the stamp, and placed it in the outgoing tray. Then she went to the shelf. She stood in front of the box for a long time, longer than she usually stood in one place without a task to accomplish. Her hands were at her sides. The padlock was a small, dull weight in the light from the window. She did not open it. Not yet. Not today. But the way she looked at it had changed. In some degree that was not visible to anyone but would have been visible to someone who had been watching her stand in this room for 14 years. A degree of readiness, perhaps. A degree of something that was not quite willingness but was close enough to willingness to be its near neighbor. She went back to the counter. The afternoon mail had arrived. She sorted it the way she had sorted it every afternoon for 14 years, carefully, without haste, giving each piece the exact attention it required, and no more. Outside, the harbor was the same color as her eyes. The tide was going out. It would come back. In the box, if someone had opened it, which no one had, and which no one would, unless Evelyn Marsh chose to allow it, they would have found the following: 7 commendations, none of them signed, none of them bearing the name of any unit that appears in the official record. Each had been written in a spare, technical language that describes circumstances without naming places or people, the language of redaction, of institutional memory being deliberately narrowed to the minimum required to mean something to the person holding it, while meaning nothing to anyone else. A small photograph, black and white, showing 6 women in cold weather gear standing in snow, their faces angled slightly away from the camera with the consistency of a deliberate instruction. In the photograph, the women's postures were easy, the ease of people entirely comfortable with the cold, with the equipment, with each other. The ease of a particular kind of competence. None of them were named on the back, a set of coordinates, handwritten, for locations in 4 countries, none of which bore any additional annotation. They required no annotation. Evelyn knew what had happened at each of those coordinates, and the knowledge was sufficient, and had always been sufficient, and would remain so. A letter in an official government envelope, dated 1989, that had never been opened. Whatever it said, acknowledgement, termination, notice. Something else, it had arrived after Evelyn had already decided that whatever the government chose to put into words was beside the point, and she had not changed this position in the years since. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had once been green and was now a color without a name, a single cartridge case, spent, its primer dimpled cleanly. This one she knew without looking at it. The weight of it was particular. The memory attached to it was not painful and was not painful. It was simply what it was, which was the most honest relationship Evelyn had ever learned to have with a memory. The longest confirmed shot in the classified record of Ghost Lattice was 3,247 meters. It was recorded once, in a single field report, and the report was destroyed in 1992 along with every other document associated with the program. The shot itself, of course, could not be destroyed. It remained what it was, a fact, at a distance, in the winter, in a place that no longer had a name. True, in the way that true things are true, regardless of whether anyone with the authority to confirm them ever does. Evelyn went home that evening along the road that ran beside the water. The light was already going. February evenings in Maine offer very little of it, and the harbor was dark and silver and wide. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because walking slowly along this road in this light, at the end of a day like this one, was something that deserved to be done slowly, a thing to be noted, filed, kept. She thought about Cole's letter, about the question that would come the first of however many, and about what it was she could answer, and what it was she couldn't, not from unwillingness, but from the fact that some things do not transfer. Some things exist only in the body, in the accumulated hours, in the long conversation between a person and a particular kind of cold. You could describe it. You could approach it from multiple angles with patient and precise language. But at some point, the description ended and the thing itself began. And that gap was not a failure of description. It was the gap between any map and any territory. She did not look back at the post office. She did not look at the box she had left on the shelf. She walked until the road turned and the water was on both sides, not quite an island, not quite a shore, and then she stood for a moment in the cold and the early dark and the wind that came in off the Atlantic, the way it always did, the way it had always done, with what felt like patience, and what she had long since understood was simply itself. She stood until the cold arrived in her coat, and then she walked home.